Well, hello from Berlin. This is 4th of August, 2025. And what I want to talk about in this recording is a lot of moving pieces here. This has got to do with the deadline that Trump has given Putin for negotiating the end of the war or ending the war in about 4 days, roughly the 8th of August. And there's a couple threats that he's made. Well, one he's already begun, and that's to supply Ukraine with much more weapons than they've been supplied with before, and that's with the Europeans paying for it. And number two, he wants to hit the energy sector of Russia. So let me back up a minute here. A lot of people, I think the media is missing what actually this is about. So I'd like to title this video, "The Oil War of 2025, ? Okay. It's very possible, I think, Trump can do this. It's possible to have a major confrontation with Russia aimed at ruining Russia's oil export capacity, which would be ruinous for its economy and its ability to wage war. So let me just go through this, why I'm saying this. So if you remember back to the beginning, when Trump came in, he had a plan A and a plan B, essentially. And plan A was that he was going to negotiate with Putin an end of the war, 24 hours, whatever. And it's clear that he really did want to negotiate an end to the war with Putin. And he explained the reasons he wanted to do this. If you listen to him or his advisors, they've always been quite consistent on this. It's different than the first Trump administration, where we had a situation where he had some ideas along these lines towards Russia at the time, but he didn't have a team that was united on it. At least that's my assessment. Now they seem quite united throughout this whole process since he came in January. The idea here is to negotiate an end to the war with Putin in a way that pulls Putin away from China, or at least closer to the West, less with China. And he's offered Putin all sorts of inducements in that regard, big investments in Russia. He was making, through his agents in Europe, Richard Grenell, for example, he was working quite actively to make it possible that Russia could get back the entire gas sector that they had before in Europe. They used to supply 40% of the gas. He's lost all that. So there's many things that were being offered to Putin in exchange for ending the war in some reason, what Trump sees as a reasonable manner. And the idea being to show Putin that he can come back to the West. I believe that when negotiations took place, also say in Riyadh with the Saudis there, that he was also offering him a special place in the future oil sector, global oil sector, together with the United States and the Saudis, who indeed, if they had a sort of a triple entente agreement on oil, they could certainly dominate the global oil market. Each one of the three of those produces more oil than any two or three other producers, actually more than any other continent by itself. So they could do this. And this was one of the inducements I think he was being offered. He may have been offered various re-entry into the Middle East and Africa, but basically that he could come out of the war making a deal and come out not looking humiliated and moving towards the West. And this was Trump saw this as very important in the beginning of his first administration too, but he couldn't go very far with it because he sees it as China as being the main threat. He's not alone in this. The entire elite of the United States, both officials and experts, see China as being a peer competitor to the United States and quite dangerous. However, everybody agreed, go back to at least three presidents, And everybody agreed that if Russia and China together, one great Eurasian landmass, this would be very difficult for the Western powers and their allies such as Japan, Australia, and so forth. It'd be very difficult. So the idea of pulling them apart is not a new idea. There was what do you call it? Resetting. They wanted to, Obama wanted to reset the relationships with Putin. Bush wanted to do something similar even before 9/11, and 9/11 threw it all off. He was on the same course. So this goes back a long way. The thing is, overwhelmingly, in the what should I say, the traditional foreign affairs circles and elites in Washington, and perhaps in Europe, much of Europe, the conclusion was reached not only after the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, but especially after the full-scale invasion of 2022, that ship had sailed. No way you're going to get Putin back. However, I must say, Macron persisted in this. This was French policy. This should be a separate video actually, but he persisted in this idea of trying to pull Putin away, and he finally failed, decided he was embarrassing himself, and in late 2023, I think, late 2023, he came to the conclusion that this is not working, and he changed his approach. So it's not alien to somebody like Macron or to most of the elites, foreign policy circles, that it would be great to pull Russia away from China. It's just that they think that ship has sailed. It's not possible. And when Trump did this, let's say he did it in his own way. He went full throttle. He really worked to convince Putin that, look, I'm not going to hold anything against you for what happened in Ukraine. You're going to be welcome back. And of course, Zelensky was scared of this at first when he saw it, but I must say, could be another video again, that Zelensky is now convinced that I think he trusts Trump and to go ahead and try this. However, from the beginning, I recall clearly in January of 2025, not too long after Trump's inauguration, there were reports that the cabinet was discussing what would be done if Plan A, that is negotiating with Putin, giving him inducements, whatever's necessary to make a fairly reasonable peace or a realistic peace, however you want to put it, in Ukraine, and offering him all sorts of inducements to come towards the West to end the war in that manner. What if this doesn't work? What if Plan A doesn't work? Well, I remember reports that the cabinet was discussing a Plan B. And the Plan B, now this is interesting. There's many people who either were with the sort of MAGA group, or even in the traditional foreign policy circles in Washington, the more conservative ones, more Republican ones, but also Democrats, who said, well, knowing Trump, if Putin messes with him, if he doesn't give him what he wants as far as ending this war after promising it to everybody, to voters, he will turn. He will turn on Putin, and he really will clamp down. Now, he's been at this for about sitting here in August, right? For 7 months at least, maybe 8 months, he's been at it, trying to convince Putin. And halfway into that, if that long, most of this foreign policy elite who thought that he would turn on Putin and follow a Plan B of coercion to end the war, they thought that no, they misread him and they gave up. But now, I took these things seriously. This was a basis of unity of much of his cabinet and people around him. Why they stuck with him? Because they knew this was Plan B. There were those, of course, who were don't want to get involved in foreign affairs, but there's many other serious people in his cabinet who did not want to see Putin win in Ukraine. So, what happened? Um, uh, Turns out Lindsey Graham has been reportedly very close to President Trump on foreign affairs. Now, they've had their ins and outs before. Graham was against him and then with him, against him, whatever. But apparently he's had his ear for quite a period of time. In the whole 12-day war in Iran, apparently Lindsey Graham had great influence on Trump and how that went. So on this matter, it is Lindsey Graham, together with a Republican of South Carolina, together with Richard Blumenthal, who's a Democrat of Connecticut. They're co-sponsoring a bill, and both of them, they've been using this terminology for quite a while, and they're still using it now. They talk about bone-crushing sanctions on Russia, energy sanctions, sanctions in general. But my perception is what they're especially talking about is energy sanctions, because we know the biggest foreign exchange source for the Russian budget is export of oil. People always talk about the big role that natural gas plays in Russia in their exports, and it does, but nothing compared to what oil does. Oil is multiple times as important, and the gas is already, that business is pretty well gone. So if somebody could cut off, if it was possible to stop Putin from exporting oil, this could be ruinous for his economy internally. Now, we could later, well, maybe another video and talk about what does ruinous mean, how fast would this have an effect, and so forth. We'll put that aside for a moment. But generally, this is the most hurtful thing that could happen to Putin. Now, I just want to say, in this, why hasn't this happened before? Why under the Biden administration, or immediately when Trump came in, why weren't there sanctions on Russian oil? Well, what happened is actually back shortly after the full-scale invasion in February 2022, the Europeans, of course, were going to put sanctions on Russian oil and start cutting off their ability to export it. Now it is, they are doing that. They have done that for their own sake, not taking Russian oil with some exceptions. But why didn't it happen? When it was clear that the European Union and others were going to move to sanction Russian oil exports, the Biden administration moved very quickly to block this. They engaged in, put a lot of effort in diplomacy to convince everybody that this should not be done. And I would say, what were the reasoning? The main reasoning here is that, Russia is one of the big three oil exporters in the world. It's nowadays the United States #1, and then the Saudis and Russia are fairly close in their capacity to export oil. And so the idea was, if you take Russian oil off the market, oh my God, there's going to be a huge crisis. And so we can't get along without Russian oil. That was the thinking. And then central bankers stepped in. Some say Mario Draghi first came up with this idea, but I think it came up from various places simultaneously. But the American central banker, Janet Yellen, got excited about it and said, hey, here's what we'll do. We can leave Russian oil on the market. They thought they were very clever. We'll leave it on the market, but we're going to announce a price cap. And if Putin tries to sell it over the price cap, he won't be able to get insurance on his ships because, Europeans and England and the Brits control almost all the insurance on ships and so forth. Anyway, those of us, people in the oil sector and people who study it closely, such as myself, for many years said, nah, this is not going to work. This is not how the oil sector works. There's just too many ways to get oil on the market, go around back doors if you do anything like this. And in fact, that's what happened. And we know the whole story about Putin getting a whole shadow fleet of older tankers. And anyway, he's been able to get around it, and it hasn't done any significant damage on Russia. Now, of course, another reason why Biden administration liked this is because to take Russian oil off the market, they thought the price would go up. If the price spikes, world oil's price spikes, the price of gasoline in the U.S. would go up, and of course, Trump's got a better chance of getting elected because he was making a big deal about bringing down the price of gas. Well, anyway, that ship sailed. So anyway, one of the arguments myself I made back then is that Biden administration was misreading the global oil market. That actually, given the lack of the lackluster nature of the Chinese economy coming out of COVID and after the European economy and other problems, there was plenty of spare oil in the market, and it looked like this was going to continue for some period of time. And in fact, for the last 2.5 years, maybe more, OPEC and OPEC Plus have kept between them offline, about 6 million barrels a day. Now, the Saudis are putting it back online. 2.2 million barrels a day was voluntary kept off voluntarily by members of OPEC Plus, together with the Saudis. In any case, if you look at how much oil Russia exports, 4.2, 4.3, I don't know, million, say 4 million barrels a day. Say you're 80% successful. You take 3.2, right, 3.325 million barrels a day offline. OPEC by itself, OPEC and OPEC Plus, had plenty of oil that they were holding offline to completely replace that oil. And right from the beginning, Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, I remember giving interviews about this, and I would cite Fatih Birol. He said there's plenty of oil in the world to replace Russia. It can be taken offline, but that isn't what happened. Okay, so myself, one reason I think I see what Trump is now up to is because it's, how should I put this? It sounds very similar to something I've been proposing and sort of quietly and then more openly talking about since at least May of 2024. It's been clear now with all that OPEC oil offline that it was actually possible. It has been possible to actually take Russian oil offline. This would be devastating to Russia. And with all that spare oil out there, if the American administration, now Trump, went quietly first to the Saudis, went quietly to the UAE, went quietly to American shale and certain other allies who can produce oil and said, look, Putin's not making deal. My plan A is not working. I'm going to have to hurt him. Hopefully I don't hurt him so badly I drive him into China's hands. Hopefully he sees the light and concedes and ends the war, and we can pull him away. But what I have to do, this is aside from giving Ukraine weapons, what I have to do is we're going to have to stop his oil exports. And what would happen? Well, what I said is the Saudis should, and the UAE and others, should quietly start putting more oil back on the market. And you can give whatever excuse you want to give. You can say it's because they want to maintain market share or whatever. But it doesn't really make sense in and of itself in a market sense. But it should be the spare capacity should as much as possibly be mobilized and get online or get close to getting it online. Why? Because we're going to cut off Russian oil exports. Now, actually, what have the Saudis done since the beginning of the year when Trump came in? Especially since April, they've done exactly that. Every month, they're announcing more and more oil is being returned to the market. They've convinced OPEC Plus to do this, and now they're working on OPEC to begin to do this. This was very helpful, of course, in Trump's 12-day and the Israeli 12-day war against Iran. The market stayed very stable with all this extra oil. But it seemingly doesn't make any sense because it's driving down the price of oil. And the International Energy Agency says that by the end of the year, if this kept going the way it is, there could be up to, I forgot, something like a couple million extra barrels in the market that drive the price of oil down in the 60s, maybe the mid or lower 60s a barrel. Okay, so since I had proposed that this happen, when I see this happening, I think maybe it's a plan. Maybe this is preparation for Plan B to squeeze Russia. Now, the question is, I'm going to cut this a little bit short now. It's getting too long. How do you take Russian oil offline? And I think there's two aspects here. All you have to do is say, we sanction it, and you put severe secondary sanctions on India and China, which are taking 90% of what's being pumped by Russia and being sold. And you go after Turkey and tell them they're taking the rest, and in particular making a lot of diesel and selling it to Europe. And Europe has said now, no, they're going to now they need proof in their latest tranche of sanctions, the 18th. They say from now on they're going to need proof from Turkey where the oil came from. So, they could cut down a lot on that oil that's going through that back door. But mainly you want to hit you want to hit China and India to get them to stop buying it. Now, I think Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal, who, by the way, have 83 co-sponsors in the Senate. So this is Plan B is very deeply supported by the entire American, bipartisan American political elite. Okay. 83 co-sponsors of the bill? Mother's Day, maybe, right? Something like that. So anyway, what they said is the secondary sanctions will actually be secondary tariffs. So fine, this plays to Trump, but it may be very effective. Trump says, the bill says up to 500% tariff on everything. The country who buys the oil continues to buy oil from Russia would get 500% tariffs on everything they export. So this would be pretty devastating. But let me make one point. What I've said from the beginning is actually it doesn't matter. Well, before I tell you why it doesn't matter, I'll tell you something else. What has been the experience in the past when the United States, say, for example, under Obama, wanted to put severe sanctions on Iran, which was exporting a few million barrels a day to China, which they are right now, too. Okay. What they did is when Obama wanted to do this during his first term, when negotiations with Iran fell apart and so forth, he said, okay, I'm going to put severe sanctions. We're going to close down their oil. Well, the Chinese, for the first time ever, went to the United Nations and said, we're going to block this. The United States can't do this. They made a big show that they're going to stand up to the United States and stand with Iran. And everybody thought, oh, China is now asserting itself finally. The U.S. it's a multipolar world. I looked into this a little bit in Washington. That isn't really what was going on. What was going on is the Chinese were saying to the Americans, we get so much oil from Iran. You guys are the deciders. You can start a war and we get all this oil cut off. This will be a crisis for us. And we've invested all this money in Iran. So what Obama did, first he sent Henry Kissinger, who was still alive then, to Beijing to calm down the Chinese. And he sent Mrs. Hillary Clinton, to see the king in Saudi Arabia. And they had a long talk. And she said, look, we want to cut off the Iranian oil. The king's all for it. But somebody has to take care of the Chinese or they'll veto this at the UN. So the king put it this way. After she left, as I was told, the UAE started increasing their oil output. When their output increased somewhere near almost exactly what the Chinese were taking from Iran, i.e. there's a substitute for Iran, the Chinese just simply flipped their vote at the UN. So the Americans, when they wanted Chinese support to sanction Iran, took care of the Chinese. Okay. Similar things were done for India. Other times Iran was being sanctioned. Long stories. So my guess is, maybe my conjecture is, when Trump went to the Middle East and had this love fest visit with the Gulf states, including Saudis, probably the discussions had already taken place, but the deal was sealed that the Saudis will take care of the global oil market because, hey, it's business. If the Americans are going to take the Russians offline, sorry, Mr. Putin, but, it's business. Somebody's got to take that market, okay? And I think that's what's going on. And number two, I would be very surprised if American diplomats working together with Gulf states and other allies who produce oil have not made some deal where China can feel assured that their oil supply, and the Indians also, will be continued at a reasonable price securely if they stop buying Russian oil. Okay. So one more thing, even if it doesn't work so well, the fact of the matter is the three westward facing, there are four main ports where Russia exports oil. One is in the Far East. But there's three others, Uslunga, Primorsk, and Novorossiya. I'm saying it wrong, but which is in the Black Sea. The other two are towards the in the Baltic and farther north in northern Europe. These three ports, westward facing ports, export the bulk of Russian oil exports. All three of those ports have long been within range of Ukrainian missiles and drones. Ukrainians have actually hit aspects of these ports, LNG, some pipeline or storage tank, something like this. But notably, and I noticed this, this was at least a year before the end of the Biden administration. It became evident that if they can hit these ports, why haven't they hit, say, an empty tanker in port before it starts loading and sink it, or start a fire, or destroy the oil storage tanks at these ports? Why haven't they destroyed the pipelines coming into the ports? They have the capacity of shutting down these ports, and it hasn't been done. And, I remember one consultancy at that time saying, well, it's obviously out of deference to the Americans. That is to say, the Americans have had this other strategy. They don't want to upset the global oil market. They want Russian oil to stay online, and the Ukrainians have been constrained not to touch those ports. However, if now sanctions are put on Russian oil to try and stop the export of Russian oil, I would imagine that the Ukrainians probably wouldn't have that same constraint at some point and could physically. So what I'm saying is, even if the secondary tariffs to enforce the sanctions on Russian oil on India and China aren't completely successful, if the United States, the Gulf, especially Saudi oil producers, aren't successful in convincing the Chinese and Indians, don't take Russian oil, we can replace it, the Ukrainians can destroy most of the export capacity. And I'll just say one more thing. Why I think there's something to this. If you look at Trump's cabinet, and you listen carefully to what people are saying, there's one fellow in the cabinet, used to be Doug Burgum, used to be the governor of North Carolina, known as a very competent fellow. It's a lot of, obviously, administrative and business experience. He has been advocating for quite a period of time that Russian oil should be taken offline. This needs to be done to get Putin to do what he has to do, what he should do, end the war in Ukraine. But Burgum says, no, he wants it permanently offline. He wants to destroy the capacity of Russia permanently, he says, to produce oil, and that'll, as a means of sort of taking care of Putin's imperialist arrogance. Now, I just point out, if Russian oil can't get exported for any period of time, weeks, say, Russia has no place to store their oil, unlike the United States or the Saudis or whatever. Most countries that produce a lot of oil have a place to store it. The Russians don't. They can keep some at the refineries and the pipelines, and that's it. They have very old fields in western Siberia, in the Urals. And those fields you can't stop. You can turn them down slower, but the slower you turn them down, the lower you turn them down, the more likely that old heavy oil in those complex old fields that are decades old, 80 years old, some of them, will stop moving. And it's almost impossible to get it moving again. And now if it's winter, forget it, it'll all wax up. So this is something like that happened in the 90s to a lot of the fields. Something like that happened in Venezuela to their fields. even without the winter. Their heavy oil fields when there was a strike there against Chavez. And it took in Russia, it took a decade, the 90s, and heavy involvement of foreign oil companies with high tech to get the oil going again. This time, they're not going to get that. So if Putin doesn't concede in a relatively short period of time, and he has to turn off those fields, him and Mr. Sechin of Rosneft have to turn off a lot of those fields. They might never get those fields back online. So Doug Bergen has a point. Russia's oil sector can be largely destroyed. It's true. And if you listen to what Energy Secretary, also in the cabinet, Chris Wright, who's been extremely active on these matters, he's made it very clear. He thinks that American shale, together with other allies, OPEC, Saudis, have plenty of oil available that they could replace Russian oil taken offline, which is the whole case I made earlier. So I think the cabinet is quite aware, seems to be dealing with all these matters, and it looks like the United States is prepared, to me, a very serious attack, devastating attack on Russia's ability to export oil, which will devastate its war industry. It's a federal economy. It's the Russian Federation's budget and their war industry. And they'll either have to concede, end the war, and move towards the West, or it's on a knife's edge. It could go the other way. If he's devastated, he could turn to China and become a cat's paw of China, even more so, a cat's paw of China. So this is why I would put it this way. I would marshal the facts. I haven't made up any of this stuff. Okay, I'm reading things into it, but I would marshal the facts in this direction: that if Trump proceeds with this in a few days, this probably it should be called the oil war of 2025, and it could very well be the end of the Russian oil sector and Russia's role in the oil in the global markets. So it'll be interesting, but also very dangerous times the next few weeks. Thank you for listening. It's a bit long. Got a lot more to say another time. I'm going to put a bunch of links in below this of many other things I've written about that are related to this. And I do have a presentation I have been giving on this, advocating a similar policy. A little bit different, but essentially the same policy, or showing how the United States could do this, and beginning under the Biden administration and continuing recently. And maybe soon I'll give you all that presentation and explain it. Thank you for listening. Goodbye from Berlin on 4 August 2025.